considered as incompatible with the teachings of St. Cyril of Alexandria. It took several days of commission work to convince them that Leo was not opposing Cyril. The episode clearly shows that it was Cyril, not Leo, who was considered at Chalcedon as the ultimate criterion of Christological orthodoxy. Leo's views were under suspicion of Nestorianism as late as the 5th session, when the same Illyrians, still rejecting those who departed from Cyrillian terminology, shouted, "The opponents are Nestorians! Let them go to Rome." The final formula approved by the council was anything but a simple acceptance of Leo's text. It was a compromise which could be imposed on the fathers when they were convinced that Leo and Cyril expressed the same truth, only using different expressions. End quote. And a footnote is provided to the above shout of the fathers, which reads, quote, "The acclamation, 'Peter has spoken thus through Leo,' often quoted as a triumph of Roman authority, seems to have actually been a defensive reaction against objections by the Illyrians." End quote. So here we have what was in fact a defensive reaction raised in defense of Leo's position against the objections of many of the bishops present, taken by many modern Roman Catholic apologists as evidence of a primacy that the very Council of Chalcedon not only denied by its very existence, but by its famous Canon 28, which we shall examine at a later point. Now, in the brief time I have available to me, I shall attempt to address two major topics. First, I shall very briefly address the issue of the patristic interpretation of the key passages upon which the papacy claims to be founded, and will demonstrate that the modern Roman interpretation of these passages flies in the face of the patristic understanding. Then I shall begin presenting just a sampling of the large body of evidence that demonstrates that the early church did not view Peter as the vicar of Christ in the Roman understanding, and hence they did not see the Bishop of Rome as the sole successor of Peter, nor the head of the universal church with jurisdictional authority over all of Christ's flock. We turn to the pivotal passage, you may be getting tired of it by now, Matthew chapter 16. When we look at the patristic information regarding this passage, we find a wide variety of interpretations. It is easy to understand why many Roman Catholic scholars felt it necessary to leave communion with Rome following Vatican I for any person, even slightly familiar with patristic interpretation and slightly concerned about being truthful, would never, ever say that the Church has always interpreted this passage as it is interpreted by that council. The first thing to note is that there simply is no one understanding of this passage in the early fathers. And what is the importance of this? Dr. Salmon said, quote, "But none of these can be reconciled with the interpretation which regards this text as containing the charter of the Church's organization. A charter would be worthless if it were left uncertain to whom it was addressed or what powers it conferred. So that the mere fact that the fathers differed in opinion as to what was meant by this rock, and that occasionally the same father wavered in his opinion on this subject, proves that none of them regarded this text as one establishing a perpetual constitution for the Christian church." End quote. Next, we note that the central aspect of Rome's understanding of this passage, specifically the identification of Peter as the rock, is in fact the minority understanding of the early church. The French Roman Catholic Lannoy surveyed the patristic evidence and found 17 citations supporting the concept that Peter is the rock of Matthew 16. Please note that this does not mean that all 16 of these fathers also felt that this meant that the Bishop of Rome was a pope, but only that they saw Matthew 16 and the phrase "this rock" as referring to Peter. However, Lannoy found 16 citations that identified the rock as Christ himself. He found 8 that identified all the apostles together as forming the rock of Matthew 16. And he found 44 citations, including that, indicating that the rock of Matthew 16 was the confession of faith made by Peter in Jesus Christ. Now, if we add these numbers together, we find that the Roman position, which claims to have always been the faith of the Catholic Church, actually represents, in Lannoy's survey, 20% of the fathers. 80% of the time, then, the early fathers expressed, in Vatican I's words, perverse opinions at the very best. I might note in passing that even as late as the Council of Trent, one can find that council referring to this passage as referring to the faith that Peter expressed. But should one Roman Catholic survey not be enough, we turn to the Jesuit Maldonatus, who writes, quote, "There are among ancient authors some who interpret on this rock, that is, on this faith, or on this confession of faith, in which thou hast called me the Son of the living God, as Hilary, and Gregory Nyssen, and Chrysostom, and Cyril of Alexandria. St. Augustine, going still further away from the true sense, interprets on this rock, that is, on myself, Christ, because Christ was the rock. But Origen, on this rock, that is to say, on all men who have the same faith." End quote. Was Maldonatus correct? Well, let's look, for example, at Hilary's statement regarding Matthew 16:18, as found in his work De Trinitate, Book 6, Chapter 37, quote, "This faith it is, which is the foundation of the church. Through this faith the gates of hell cannot prevail against her. This is the faith which has the keys of the kingdom of heaven." End quote. Indeed, as one reads all of chapter 37, one finds Hilary referring to each of the prime texts upon which the papacy is built, including John 21 and Luke 22, and yet not once mentioning the papacy. Can you imagine a modern Roman apologist citing all three of these passages and not mentioning the papacy? From whence cometh this perverse notion that the passage here refers to the faith of Peter's confession, not to Peter himself? Was it not, as we've been told, the common belief of Christians for centuries before that this passage referred to Peter, thus establishing the papacy? How could Hilary be ignorant of such a fundamental concept? And how could he be joined by the likes of John Chrysostom or Gregory Nazianzus? How could these great men and preachers be ignorant of such a basic truth, unless perhaps it's not such a basic truth at all? And what of the great Augustine? Surely many are aware of his statement in his Retractionis regarding this passage and its meaning, and I shall not take the time to read it yet once again. I would point out, however, that Augustine left his readers to decide how they would interpret the passage. May I ask us all to think seriously about what it means that the great Bishop of Hippo, Augustine, could think that how one views this passage is a matter of freedom, when Vatican I tells us it is a matter upon which the anathema can and should be used. Can we not see in this the tremendously huge amount of evolution that has taken place between the early part of the 5th century and the latter part of the 19th? Indeed we can. The Roman interpretation of Matthew 16 is vulnerable on many other points as well. In fact, it requires of us faith in a long, intricate, and highly questionable chain of propositions. First, Jesus must be referring to Peter as the rock. Second, this must involve a giving of authority to Peter that is given to no one else. Third, this passage must somehow provide to us something about successors to the Roman position to have any meaning at all. Yet the idea of succession in Matthew 16 is simply absent from the understanding of the early fathers. As Oscar Kuhlmann said, quote, "We thus see that the exegesis that the Reformation gave was not first invented for their struggle against the papacy. It rests upon an older patristic tradition," end quote. And the great historian von Derlinger in his work, The Pope and the Council, said, quote, "Of all the fathers who interpret these passages in the Gospels, Matthew 16:18, John 21:17, not a single one applies them to the Roman bishops as Peter's successors." How many fathers have busied themselves with these texts, yet not one of them whose commentaries we possess, Origen, Chrysostom, Hilary, Augustine, Cyril, Theodoret, and those whose interpretations are collected in Catinas, has dropped the faintest hint that the primacy of Rome is the consequence of the commission and promise to Peter. Not one of them has explained the rock or foundation on which Christ would build his church, of the office given to Peter to be transmitted to his successors. But they understood by it either Christ himself or Peter's confession of faith in Christ, often both together. Or else they thought Peter was the foundation equally with all the other apostles, the 12 being together the foundation stones of the